Welcome, everyone, to episode 2 of the Jon Kragh podcast. Today, I have Eric Almquist, a advisory partner at Bain, who has created something called the Elements of Value B2B and B2C, among many other great articles on things like Harvard Business Review and other publications. Eric's work has greatly influenced me in my business life. It's something that I reflect back to when I do presentations, when I'm doing any kind of delivery decks, when I'm focusing on the value proposition of my business. It has been really a cornerstone of the work that I do. And I've been asking Eric for probably about a year now. I would love to get on and talk about his work. And today we're fortunate enough to have Eric spend some time with us. So welcome to the podcast, Eric. And if you could just introduce yourself and a little background about yourself.
Sure. It's great to be here, John. We finally made it happen. My name's Eric Almquist. As John said, I'm an advisory partner at Bain & Company. I have spent 42 years in consulting, all focused on customers, that is consumers and B2B customers of our clients, and helping those clients basically increase revenues, increase profitability, largely by providing better products and services over time. My background is actually in social science. I have a PhD in anthropology, of all things, but I was trained in both qualitative and quantitative methods, and I guess I'm mostly well known for my quantitative background. I created one of the first marketing science units in the consulting industry when I was with a firm called Temple Barker & Sloan that became Mercer Management Consulting, that became Oliver Wyman, and I joined Bain in 2007.
Wonderful. So what was it that drew you to really what it seems like a combination of human behavior and data analytics? You know, sometimes those can be two very different disciplines. You know, What was it about those two things that drew you in to combine those two skill sets?
Well, one was the early in my career, I discovered something called discrete choice models, which were developed by Dan McFadden, who is an emeritus professor at the University of California. McFadden actually won the Nobel Prize in economics for his development of discrete choice models. It's just a way of simulating how people make choices in such a way, using experimental designs and logistic regressions, so that one can understand what is driving behavior. Is it price? Is it product features? Which product features? And so forth. And so we basically in 1984 began to invest in using discrete choice models, and we did literally hundreds of studies as industries were deregulating. The whole telco industry, for example, deregulated in 84, I believe. And, suddenly all those players were discovering competition, like AT&T and US West and Bell South, et cetera. They suddenly had competitors. And they really needed to understand how consumers make choices when faced with competitive alternatives. So that's kind of how I got into it. McFadden was a big influence, and the behavioral economists like Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman were also very early influencers of my thinking.
In that early research that you were doing, were there any big surprises that surprised you in the findings of, why people made choices the way that they did, based on the data or based on the research, or was it more confirmatory on your intuition on how people behaved?
I think the surprising thing to me early on was how important brand was to choices. And with discrete choice models, we had, for the first time, a tool to actually separate brand out from the rest of the value proposition mix and quantify the impact of brand, all else being equal.
Wow.
And it surprised me so much that, I thought about it for 6 or 7 years, and finally we actually began to turn it into a product. We had a guy named Geoffrey Swait who wrote a very famous article called the brand equalization price. I believe that's what it's called.
Wow.
He later went back to academia, but we actually turned that into a measure of brand equity that we used for many clients. I would
Wow.
say in large part, it was also confirmatory. For example, I read an article in Scientific American in about 1981 and thought about it for a while. And we finally, I think it was roughly 1984, for one of the telecoms, we tested Tversky and Kahneman's prospect theory in some research that we did. And it totally confirmed what they had quantified in kind of among college students.
Wow.
That there is a value in the status quo, and people are quite risk averse in they'll take a risk to avoid a loss more than to gain a gain.
That's incredible. Yeah. So in the data analytics, or focusing on modeling and everything else, that's a huge focus. How much time did you spend on more human behavior research, psychology, those type of things? In your past, is that something that you also dove into to a degree?
Yeah, I mean, as a social scientist, I read broadly. I mean, discrete choice models came out of transportation economics. It was first applied to the BART system in the Bay Area. And actually, McFadden sort of won the Nobel Prize for predicting the first year demand almost precisely for BART. I also read, as psychology began to infiltrate economics, which we now know as behavioral economics, I read widely in that. But I was not trained in psychology. I certainly read Maslow's, some of Maslow's original work, which finally I began to apply to what we're going to talk about in a few minutes, the elements of value.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's where I was a little bit curious, because as we get into it for the listeners, as you'll go through, the elements of value is this hierarchy that I think the structure of it is super helpful for internalizing the model. So we'll get into it, but the Eric has put together, and his team have put together, I think 30 plus attributes for B2B, if we just focus on that for a second. But then the ordering and the categorization of that into Maslow's hierarchy, I wanted to see, where did that come from in your past to organize it in such a way that was easy to kind of latch onto and use. Great. Well, why don't we dive in? I know, Eric, you've prepared some slides, so I think why don't we pull those up so we can walk some of the listeners and viewers. I'm hoping that people will watch this mostly on YouTube. The slides that you've prepared will be great to share.
These are just a few slides that I've pulled from countless slides on the elements of value. We've been doing this now for about 7 years. By way of background, just a couple preliminary comments. About 2005, I began thinking about what value actually is to consumers. And we're going to talk about the consumer elements of value here as opposed to the B2B, which we've also developed. But, what is experienced as valuable? That's what the elements of value are about. What do people experience as value? And I frankly was at a point in my career where I had learned a lot of things, but I'd never really stopped to sort of put it together. And it was, as we did our work with consumers and B2B customers, it was almost like we started from scratch every time. And it just didn't seem to make any sense to start from scratch every time.
Right.
So I began to look around in the literature. I started in economics. I looked at philosophy. I obviously looked at Maslow, which is really a theory of human motivation more than value. But I was really kind of amazed that there was very little in economics about what value is. Economists, I think, kind of assume that value is just the other side of price. What are you willing to pay for? And so I was very surprised there was little literature in economics. There's a Japanese professor who had developed a model called the Kano model, which was more about features and functionality, a little bit closer almost to discrete choice analysis. But there didn't seem to be any major frameworks about what value is. I think there was a lot of ad hoc work that people had done.
Yep.
But so that was pretty amazing. I did discover some literature in philosophy about extrinsic and intrinsic value, but frankly, it was very academic and not very helpful. So I began to think about it very slowly. In roughly 2012 or 13, I had identified just through thought experiments about 24, 25 elements of value. And I presented it to the Bain NPS forum members, Net Promoter Score forum, and people were quite intrigued. So we decided to invest. We invested in a team in 2014, 2015, and did the first research that was based on about 10 to 11,000 interviews with consumers. Wow. Looking at various categories. And we've probably done close to 1 million interviews globally.
That's incredible. Yeah, and just for the listeners, I'm completely aligned in that it was hard to find a framework. So I run a software business. I'm very engineering focused, but I also have another side of me that's very focused on human behavior. So I've been very interested in finding frameworks or heuristics around answering this question about what is value. And that's what led me to Eric's work. And it's just so phenomenal that it really is the cornerstone of so many things that we do now. And that's because it is a framework that I don't have to start from scratch. If I'm doing a presentation to a board or something like that for a new initiative that we have, I'm looking at, I have the elements of value pulled up and saying, I'm going to anchor, these 3 or 4 things are really what we're trying to achieve. It's a clarification device for me personally. So that's, thank you for doing this work and making that realization, because I think a lot of people that I'm hoping at what they get out of this when they watch this is that they don't have to start from scratch on these things. They can jump, they can take all of the work that your team has done and start way ahead of where they would have if they were just, starting from, okay, let's have conversations on what our customers might think of. You have a framework and more of a checkbox kind of list.
Exactly. So why don't we go through a few slides and then we'll come back and talk more generally. So the question we started with was basically, what is value? And we do know a few things about value. We did back then. One is, it was very clear that value is fleeting. Everybody knows the Borders book story. I won't go into it, but Amazon came along and made book buying much easier. No driving, no parking, no finding, out of stocks, etc. And Borders ultimately went under. I think a more interesting example is the Palm Pilot. John, I don't know if you're old enough to have had a Palm Pilot.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I ask this whenever I meet with people. I say, how many of you used a Palm Pilot? And typically, all the hands go up. It's pretty amazing. And then I say, how many of you are still using it? And everybody laughs. But the Palm Pilot was actually, to me, the most useful product that I had in business at the time. This was roughly in the late 90s. And you actually see 2 elements of value in that statement there. The connected organizer connects and organizes are 2 of our 30 elements of value. I had the U.S. Robotics Palm Pilot, and I had purchased a Apple Newton about 6 months before, which was a terrible product. And not only was it bad software, but it was green colored.
Wow.
Which is, when we think of Apple today, just makes no sense. But that was sort of the dark days of Apple. They came back with a vengeance. But what happened with the Palm Pilot? It's not like the product got worse or provided less value. It was that a better mousetrap came along, and that was called the BlackBerry. And of course, we all had Blackberries and for many years. And then what happened to the Blackberry? The smartphone came along. And what was interesting about the smartphone is that, as Jobs said in his initial announcement many years ago, they separated the sort of ergonomics, the user interface, from the device and put the user interface into the apps, and that just unlocked huge amounts of value.
Wow.
And so you remember what it was like to use your first iPhone or Samsung Galaxy. There was a feeling like it was miraculous, and your whole life eventually ended up on that phone. It's sort of like the smartphone is an element of value delivery device.
For sure.
So,
I often think about, just on that particular point, I always think about my children, who it's like pre and post printing press. It's probably more dramatic.
I know. Yeah, it's incredible. So we know value is fleeting. We also know it's based in human psychology, and Maslow was really the first psychologist to focus on human motivation in a serious way, and what one needs in life to live a good life. His pyramid, actually, he did not develop. It was developed by an MIT professor many years later. And there are a lot of misconceptions about Maslow. People think that you have to fulfill all the physiological needs before you can move on to safety and belonging and love, etc. And while that's kind of generally true, there are lots of exceptions. You have starving artists, you have rock climbers who risk their lives to self-actualize, and there are many other examples. But in general, it's a quite compelling theory. Lots of marketers know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but it was our observation that relatively few people can put it to use, because it's more about human motivation than it is about the experience of value from products and services. So, but we used it as an analogy and as an inspiration. Some jokers on the internet have added internet connection and battery life to the bottom of the pyramid, which is meant to be humorous, but there's some truth to that. I mean, when you suddenly discover yourself without your phone, or your battery runs dead, it's pretty serious. And you might actually skip lunch to charge your phone. So maybe it's even more important than some basic physiological at various times.
For sure. And I always think about that as a human capabilities thing. Like we're much more capable as humans, if used appropriately, with this device that you have access to all of this information and everything else. So in some ways I agree with you. There's something to be, it's funny, but maybe there's something to that, because it's a capabilities enhancement.
Exactly. So we began to do research. We started with basic qualitative research and kind of reviewing a lot of studies that we'd done at Bain, to try to look for different types of value. As I said before, by the time I got a case team to start doing some fundamental research here, I'd already identified about 24, 25 elements of value, and we finally pushed that to 30. But these are examples. Like, if you listen to people talk about Nespresso, it's a great machine, it's beautiful, it saves me time, it's simple, lets me fantasize about being back in Italy. I won't go through all of these, but those are the kinds of things we would hear about. Variety with Netflix. What's interesting about variety at Netflix is the cable companies actually have larger libraries than Netflix does. I believe that's still true. And yet Netflix has done such a great job of organizing and presenting that variety in such a beautiful and intuitive way that People think that Netflix actually has more variety than the cable companies. And Amazon, I mean, I'm going to talk about Amazon a little bit later, but Amazon just crushes what we call the functional elements of value. And I'll show you some data on that in a second.
Yeah, and something with the Netflix and the organization point that you brought up that's really interesting. When I look at your work, the organization, when I looked at ease of doing business, that's not something that I necessarily focused on per se in the B2B world, although it was not I did not explicitly focus on that, and that's been a huge takeaway over the last couple of months, is really looking at your work and looking at the ease of doing business, and that's the Netflix, the Amazon, everything else. That's been a huge driver for me, is how do I reduce that friction? How do I help customers do business more easily?
And frankly, you know, the B2B world brings the consumer world to work. I mean, if you've been dealing with Amazon as a just an ordinary consumer customer, you don't expect you know, you don't expect things to, you're not going to let people get away with not being as responsive as Amazon, if you see what I mean. So
yeah.
And we actually have some evidence that Amazon has been changing fundamental consumer expectations.
Wow.
And that applies to, you know, across many categories of products and services. So
great.
These are the elements of value. And as I said before, we do have a B2B elements of value framework as well. This is more than a framework, by the way. It's also a way of collecting data and quantifying both the how successful people are in delivering value, as well as what's important by category. So it's arranged in 4 levels: functional elements, emotional elements, life-changing elements, and elements that really have to do with impact on society. And we developed this first in 2015, but since then we've actually added some attributes having to do with sustainability, environmental, social, and economic. We've added those to the kind of the top of the pyramid. If you look at the functional elements, and this is where Amazon does really well. Just think of the time they save you, the simplification. They reduce effort. You don't have to drive. You don't have to park. You don't have to carry goods to the car. Things are delivered to your home, and it's really been transformational. And they deliver on 8 of those functional elements of value at a level that most retailers cannot compete with. And that's why they've been taking share for now, 25 years. And what's interesting is, to me, Jon, is I'm not sure that I even like Amazon. I hear things that they can be tough on employees. I don't know how much of that is true. I know they're trying to address that. But I don't love Amazon. I don't feel like I have an emotional relationship to Amazon. But every time I think about finding something, particularly from the long tail, it might be a camera lens, or it might be a particular tool or something like that. I turn to Amazon because they just make those functional interactions, those basic requirements of finding and buying. They just make those so simple and easy.
Well, that's really interesting from a weighting perspective on how important these foundational elements are and how powerful they can be, because there's a I guess an anti-Amazon kind of sentiment growing that I hadn't seen in the last few years, but I don't believe it's changing behavior really at all. So that goes to show how powerful some of those foundational elements could be.
I think that's right. So where some behavior has changed, and I'll give you this example a little bit later, is there is one competitor that has really brought the same elements of value to bear on pet food, and they have taken a lot of share from Amazon. But we'll come back to that.
Okay,
so
great.
One of the first lessons that we Well, let me go through the elements first. Then there's this emotional level, which has to do with things like reducing anxiety or fun and entertainment. I mean, there are whole industries that are that prosper because they cater to fun and entertainment. The movie industry, the theme parks and cruise lines. Reducing anxiety can be a very powerful type of value. And just to give you an example where this can really make a difference, if you're applying for a mortgage and you're in that process and you're about to buy a house and you're worried about things falling through and all that, mortgage providers really need to deal with this anxiety issue. Otherwise, if you can just update your customer on where they are, where it stands, when they're going to hear, it just makes life much better for your customer.
Yeah.
Nostalgia is an element of value that is not that common, but it's very distinctive when you see it. So Disney plays into that a lot with their historical characters.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. Heirloom, up in the life-changing elements, heirloom is value to future generations, so value to your children or their children. And that's very important. Companies like Vanguard, especially in financial services, companies like Vanguard deliver that at threshold and so forth. The way we measure these elements of value, just so you know, is we have an attribute for each of the elements of value. We use the same 0 to 10 point scale in a survey that Net Promoter Score uses. So we use the same numerical scale, and we ask people to tell us how much of that type of value is delivered, let's say through using an iPhone or an iPad or a car or going to Disney World or whatever it might be. And we have done a lot of work on what the thresholds are. For most industries, we use a threshold of 50%, 8, 9s, and 10s on that scale. So if your customers give you a 8, 9, or 10, if 50% of your customers give you an 8, 9, or 10, we declare that to be a threshold.
Okay.
Now, on something like saves time, I believe Amazon is up around 75%, for example. So they're well over the threshold. And one other thing I wanted to mention is we developed these elements of value to be category agnostic. In other words, these are not banking specific attributes. These are not telco specific attributes. These are at an altitude where you can potentially apply them to almost any consumer, well, I will say to any consumer category.
Yep.
Right? Now, some of them are not going to be relevant. We don't think, badge value is about value that you feel by showing that you are a customer of, let's say, you own a Harley Davidson. Harley Davidson is the classic badge value. It says you're a Harley owner, you're a Harley person.
Yeah.
You affiliate and belong to that same group. Banks banks are not going to be badge value.
Right.
Possibly USAA might achieve something close there, but probably not.
I've heard you talk about this to a degree on what the relevance is of these different attributes to different industries.
Yeah.
Do you internally have a weighting mechanism by industry for?
Yeah. So what we do is for each set of competitors in an industry, we gather the elements of value data, and then we use something called random forest regression to quantify the impact that the different attributes have, or the different elements of value have on Net Promoter Score. So it's typically Net Promoter Score that we are looking at in terms of quantifying the importance of the elements.
Got it.
Quality is almost always number one. In fact, we debated early on whether quality is a separate element of value or whether it applied to all the elements, all the other elements. You're either good or you're either high quality on that or not.
Yep.
But consumers talk about quality and they can identify what quality means in almost every category. So we did include it. But so in consumer products, quality, sensory appeal, and variety, those tend to be the kind of the most important. In the cruise industry, they provide value all over this pyramid, and in fact, Disney Cruises provides more value than any other proposition we have seen. Now, not everyone wants to be a Disney Cruise customer because people might not like cruising. But if you're into cruising with your family, you're probably going to really like Disney Cruises.
we had one booked before COVID hit, and then it got canceled. So I'm with you. That's really interesting to hear, and we were excited, and we didn't care about paying the premium, right? Well, I mean, it wasn't as if it felt worth it, I should say. It's probably the more accurate way to state it.
And that shows up in the elements of value. They clear our threshold on something like 17 of the 30 elements of value.
Yeah, that's
incredible. And I have a colleague who was in a client meeting in Chicago about a year ago, and she was talking about the elements of value. And she asked people to name the companies that were really provided outstanding value to them. And several of the clients, it was probably a dozen people in the meeting, something like 6 of them mentioned Disney Cruises.
Wow.
And they all had children, and it's kind of they were sort of the perfect demographic for Disney Cruises. But it's amazing. Anyway,
it's worth studying then. That's great.
So one of the things we found in doing our work, John, is that we found that it is both how well you're achieving on the elements where you play, but it's also the number of elements of value that you deliver on at threshold that really counts. Now, you can have a very successful business delivering well on 2 or 3 elements of value. So for example, most retailers do well on quality, variety, and maybe if they're Walmart or Target, reduces cost. Mm-hmm. But keep in mind that they've been losing share for now 25 years to Amazon, or that they've been using volume and share, depending on which competitor it is, for 25 years. So, Amazon is out delivering them on value in general, and will, as long as there's that gap, will continue to take business from them. So
perfect. Yeah, this is and I think you said I've heard you in other interviews talk about how much you've studied Amazon.
Yeah.
So is that something that you alluded to, maybe touching on that?
We're gonna talk about that in just a second.
Yep.
So I already covered this. This is how we measure the elements, the 8 plus on the 0 to 10 scale, 50%, and random forest regression. I talked about that. That gives us the relative importance. We don't ask people how important them are. We derive how important it is in predicting NPS.
And okay, so that on NPS, NPS, just for anybody who may not be aware of NPS, could you give the 2-second overview of NPS?
So my colleague, Fred Reicheld, who's an amazing person, and I would recommend that anyone out there read his work. Probably many of you have. He studied a number of customer satisfaction metrics. This is going back to around the year 2000. They looked at many different questions around customer satisfaction and loyalty, and they played around with some of those measurements, and they found that the question, how likely are you to recommend, let's say, Ford to friends and relatives on that 0 to 10 scale? Turns out that it's a very powerful question in predicting growth and repurchase. And the net promoter score, it was a Bain invention, which we we developed a way, we basically subtracted detractors from promoters. So and that's a promoter is a 9 and 10 on that scale, a neutral is 7 to 8, and a detractor is 0 to 6. And that subtraction actually magnifies the power of the measurement. So that's, you can read about this. Just go online. There are a million sites. It's one of the most. It's just kind of taken over the loyalty and customer satisfaction.
Yeah. And I assume anybody watching this episode would be familiar with it, but just in case if anybody wasn't, it's worth the 2-minute detour.
Yep.
Fantastic. Thank you.
This is why you should pay attention to the elements of value that you're delivering. We've looked at growth. We've looked at NPS. We've looked at market share gain. We've looked at NPS increase over time. And you see the shape of those curves, kind of going up and to the right. The more elements of value you deliver, essentially, the better it is, better the results are. If you're delivering more elements of value, you are likely to be in share gain. And if you are increasing the elements over time, you're likely to be an NPS increase. We have really compelling data on this in consumer products, both in the United States and now we have a data set in Europe that we've collected. And we've been able to tie that to IRI data at the brand level. And it's the same patterns, basically.
That's incredible.
Even more powerful, if you will, because we've looked at household penetration, we've looked at revenue growth, and we've looked at repeat purchase within a year. So
when did you start collecting the data on the elements of value to measure the relative change in performance on the attributes for the companies that you were studying? So when did that data capture start?
So as I mentioned before, in 2015, we did about 11,000 interviews in that survey, as I recall. In 2018, we did about 45,000 interviews in the United States, and we also did 6 discrete choice models to see the impact of the elements of value on price sensitivity. You mentioned before you didn't mind paying the premium for Disney. Well, it turns out the more elements of value you deliver, the higher your pricing power. Yes.
Yeah, those are strong. That's strong correlation right there. That that should open some eyes if anybody needs This interview is taking it from I have personal experience knowing that when I drive my messaging in board presentations and so forth, and I anchor to ones that I know that particular industry may care about, whether it be financial services, healthcare, et cetera. I see the results because I'm very clear on my message and value proposition by anchoring to that. So, but this is the first time that I'm seeing this kind of tie back to the increase in growth, and that's phenomenal.
I will send you these slides. I'll also send you the work that we've done in consumer products. Let's see, what other thing do I want to mention here? So, but anyway, this is essentially why one needs to pay attention to how you're delivering value and what kinds of value you're delivering. We have found, by the way, that the emotional elements and above on the pyramid are worth about 1.5 times the value of the functional elements on average. So if you're on average, the functional elements are less powerful than the more emotional, which I think stands to reason. I mean, that's why emotional connection through a brand has the kind of effect that I've been studying now for almost 40 years. It's the emotional connections really matter.
That's a very interesting quantification. And you hear it in sales, people buy with the emotion and back it up with logic and reason and those type of things that get thrown around. But it's really interesting to see the hard numbers behind things like that.
Yeah. Well, every year we have more and more of those hard numbers, and it's all confirmatory. So,
wow.
One thing our clients have been doing with this, and we've done a lot of work in this, is that they're not only using the elements of value to understand the value they're delivering, but also as a way of connecting their purpose to their brand positioning and to the actual value propositions that they're delivering, including what we call hallmark experiences. Hallmarks is not a Bain term. We didn't invent that, but it's kind of out there in the world. And just to give you an example of a hallmark experience, I've asked a lot of people, when they bought their iPhone, did they keep the packaging? And the vast majority of people keep the packaging because it's so beautiful, and they just can't bear to depart with it. And Apple actually worked on this in a very deliberate way. They engineered it so it takes about 7 to 8 seconds to open that box. You cannot open it faster without ripping it or something. And it kind of extends the experience of opening that product.
Wow, there's the new MPS. Have you kept the packaging?
Yeah.
Exactly. How likely are you to keep the packaging? That's a really interesting question on that. But that's
yeah. Unfortunately, I mean, I would love to see more work done on packaging in general. As I get older, the packages get harder to open, and frankly, I think the world needs to eliminate plastic from packaging completely. But I'm sure there are people working on that, but it's not unimportant for sure. It's a minor example of a hallmark moment. Apple has many of them. I don't know if you have bought a product directly from Apple, but you can now deliver it to your home. They deliver it to your home in under 2 hours, and you get to track it on Uber, and you can meet the driver at the curbside if you want. It's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. Yeah. So anyway, this is really about the two major ways to use the elements of value. One is to try to deliver more value on the elements that drive NPS in your category. The other is to try to add new elements of value or increase the weight of the elements that you are strong in. And just to give you an example, and we can kind of finish up the slides here with this, but there are companies that have deliberately added more value and added new elements of value over time. And just to give you a couple examples from Bain's own research, this is Bain data. This is T-Mobile. As you know, T-Mobile had launched an Un-carrier campaign back in about 2013. They were in pretty rough financial shape, and I think they decided, what do we have to lose? And so they changed their value proposition. They got rid of contracts. They went to a one price policy, no fees and taxes and all that kind of stuff. They started giving away streaming, movie streaming for free. They had some clever international plans. It's a long story, but they deliberately changed their value proposition. They changed their marketing. They had a kind of rebellious Un-carrier strategy, they called it. And they went from one element of value in 2015 to 4 in 2018. They're still at 4, but now they're closer to threshold on a whole bunch of elements of value. Wow. They have really changed their business, and their market cap, I forget the statistics, but I think their market cap increased like $30 billion during this time.
So that's a really interesting economic indicator on a company on here. So from an investment perspective, looking at this and getting these measurements could be could be very, very powerful from a perspective of how much a company may grow in the future.
Well, absolutely. We've actually had a couple investment firms ask us about using the elements of value to construct a fund. And I know Fred Reichheld has done a lot of work on the value of loyalty leaders, that is companies that are doing very well on Net Promoter Score. He's tracked them over time, and they vastly outperform the market. And frankly, I think he's invested his own personal money. I heard him say this according to that. And so I think there's some very interesting things one could do here. I've been so busy with the elements of value and consulting that I maybe I should have spent all my time investing instead. But but I'm more motivated by ideas than I am money. So anyway.
Yeah, that's really compelling. I mean, the data sets that you showed a couple slides back, I just have it from personal experience. I know it makes a difference.
Yeah,
I know it's impacted my business. It clearly has impacted my business. Customers are more clear about what the value that they're getting, everything else. So this is a great case study.
Yeah, and a similar pattern with Vanguard. So we looked at Vanguard in 2015. We also looked at them in 2018, and they are delivering on more elements of value. You'll see that they increased on reducing anxiety and providing hope. They are delivering now on reducing cost. We haven't done this since COVID, by the way. That's why this is 2018. But what did they do during the interim? They did a lot of things, but one of the key things they did was they developed something called a personal advice service.
Mm-hmm.
So Vanguard realized back in about 2013 that they had a lot of customers who came to Vanguard but had not opted into the Vanguard philosophy of sort of, don't pick stocks, asset allocate, don't buy and sell, just ride out the long term. That's kind of the Vanguard philosophy, and use index funds and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But they had a big 401k business, so they brought in a lot of customers who had not opted into that. And we're calling them up and asking them to pick stocks or buy certain securities or whatever. And they realized that they had an increasing number of customers who needed advice. And in 2015, they launched the personal advice service. So probably just right after we did this baseline read in 2015. They did other things. They lowered their fees. They increased the number of analysts they had. They did a lot of things for their value proposition, but it shows up in the numbers. I mean, they're now at 9. And you might be a cynical business type and kind of say, well, the market was growing between 2015, 2018. But in fact, Fidelity dropped in the number of elements of value during that period. They lost 1, I believe. And other players like Schwab remain more or less the same. So this was another deliberate and successful attempt to really change the value equation for their customers.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's fantastic.
Let me just comment on Amazon briefly. I already told you this. Both in 2015, 2018, they delivered on 8 elements of value, almost all of which were functional: saves time, simplifies, etc. Provides access. You might say, well, why is that more emotional? Well, if you're looking for an obscure product and you find it on Amazon, you are kind of delighted that happened. It's like, oh wow, I thought this was going to be a search that was going to be a lost cause. But so providing access can be very important. You know, my favorite example here is Ancestry.com. What Ancestry did was they took the Mormon databases that the Mormon Church had developed over the years, and they digitized it. And so now genealogists can access immense amounts of genealogical data, which is a very kind of emotionally charged hobby for a lot of people. And so that's why we provides access where we did on the pyramid. But that's what Amazon is. This is their success formula. Not only are they delivering at threshold on these elements, but they are well above threshold on most of them. And then what's interesting is along comes Chewy, and Chewy delivers on the exact same elements of value at threshold as Amazon, but, and this is my last slide, they actually do a little bit better than Amazon on many of them.
Wow.
So that is, in essence, the reason why Chewy has been successful at Amazon's own game. And this is actually kind of quantitative proof of that, if you will.
That's, you know, for someone to split out a category and beat Amazon on those attributes is a story worth investigating. You know, how are they going about doing that to the degree that they are?
Yeah. I am dying to get more data. I don't know when we will, because COVID has kind of disrupted things. But my hypothesis is that, you know, pets grew in importance during COVID. A lot of people adopted dogs. A lot of people didn't want to go to the store. So I'll bet Chewy is actually delivering more value than it was in 2018 when we got this data. I don't know about Amazon.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
We'll the numbers will eventually reveal the story, but it's this is a remarkable story of success for Chewy.
You know, looking at these attributes that you brought out, it's interesting in that, you know, I know that you said that there's different attributes matter differently to different industries, and probably, at least in the B2B stake, that are different between stakeholders and decision makers, right? So the weighting is different. But if you were to have a grab bag of values to anchor to in a B2C business and anchor to, you know, this bucket of values here looks like at least a good starting point to say, hey, you know, if I were to pick any, maybe I should just look at these to start with. Yeah,
that is. I mean, so we're looking at retail here, basically, John. So you know, these are the attributes that that you need to provide, kind of as basics in retail. Amazon does really well on them. You've got to do, you know, reasonably well on them, and then maybe you can deliver some fun or entertainment or some affiliation and belonging, or something else, design aesthetics like Nespresso has done. So, you know, if I think Chewy was very brave to take on Amazon, and I don't know the whole story. There may have been ex-Amazon people at Chewy, and they knew the model. But if I were starting a new retail store, I would try to do as well as I could on the functional elements of value, and then go after 2 to 3 higher order elements and try to deliver on those. And I think we do see retailers that are trying to do this. COVID has been a very weird time for retail, so it's probably a strange moment in history to be talking about that. But you know, as you look at a lot of the insurgents out there, they are playing on wellness, on design aesthetics. You know, if you think about some of the consumer products that are quite differentiated, a lot of them are playing on sort of non-traditional elements of value. That could be packaging, it could be quality in the sense of authenticness, it's and wellness. So
Got it.
anyway,
Yeah. Well, this is
I'll get rid of these slides now.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to put that in for everyone. And
sure,
I was not expecting to see the however, I was not surprised to see the hard numbers tied to growth. So, in service to the listeners that may pop in on this episode and see clips of it at some point, I think that's more of a reason to start paying attention. And I've said that a few times during this episode, in that how much these things have impacted me from just a personal experience. But seeing your hard numbers really says, okay, here's an opportunity to deliver on things that matter to customers, right? Yeah. So when I was coming into this interview, I was thinking a couple different angles that we could potentially take it. And what I want to do is, at a personal level, is help people decide that to take their limited energy and resources and spend them on the right things. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And I think one of the remarkable things about Amazon is, its business model is really amazing, and their warehousing and just the supply chain. But if you go back to when Bezos was doing the investor calls, he would spend something like over half the time talking about their customer satisfaction ratings. Yeah. And it is probably the most customer-centric business in history. And maybe they should have been spending a little more time with employees, because they've gotten a little bit of turbulence around that. But they seem to be doing that now. We'll see. But they are almost the definition of customer centricity. It's amazing.
And I, in the stone ages of e-commerce, 1999, 2000, 2001, I worked at barnesandnoble.com. We were a competitor. And believe it or not, but that was a pretty decent size. It was the fourth largest e-tailer at the time. Books were, I guess, the natural starting point for e-commerce because of access. Most likely it's because access. How do you store millions of titles in a bookstore? You can't, right? Yeah. So it was like the first touch of that access piece that you brought up earlier. And so that was what, and I would have episodes. I would come home. I would come home. There'd be Charlie Rose playing in the background. He'd be interviewing Jeff Bezos, and he said a couple things during that time to echo that he was totally focused on customers. I was not hearing any of that come out of the stuff that maybe it was. I was just a developer, so I was not in strategy meetings. So they certainly could be, but the public-facing image at a minimum of Amazon was always about that, and I think that's always been that's been something that's been timeless. The other thing that Jeff Bezos said during that time that I found interesting, and when I look at your elements, I'm trying to figure out, is that he was saying during those interviews, we're not really focused. People are always asking me what's going to be the next year, what's going to be he was focused on what's going to stay the same. Right. What's not going to change? Yeah. And the things that he said, I can guarantee you that people are always going to want their packages faster, cheaper. Yeah. And there was another attribute on it that he brought up. And looking at your elements, I'm saying, which are I know that you're in the beginning of your slide deck, value is fleeting, and that's probably the delivery mechanism or the product or service may be fleeting. But I think there's a lot of timeless elements there in how you form the abstractions in your model, that those are probably timeless in themselves.
Yeah, and I think what is timeless also, or what helps with keeping value from being fleeting, is the number of elements of value that you're delivering on. The more you can deliver, I think the longer you can sustain it. But I actually think we're now living in a world where there is very little in the way of sustainable competitive advantage, because there's so much dry powder in private equity. There's so much VC money. There's so many entrepreneurs around the globe. We've got China being more creative, more entrepreneurial. I think, you gotta to stay competitive, you gotta focus on value and to not assume that you've created something, sustainable. I'm sure BlackBerry thought they had it made, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Now BlackBerry is an app within competitors' smartphones, right?
It's a lesson for us all to reflect on. And
Yeah.
Well, Eric, thank you for putting together this slide deck. I think this is going to work really well on YouTube, especially. So
Great.
As we start to push this out to multiple channels, this is episode 2. I have a few more guests lined up this month. I'm going to definitely push it out on all of the audio platforms, but I'm hoping that listeners, if they do catch us on an audio platform, come in onto YouTube and watch this, because there's a ton of value in the slides that you prepared. And
Great.
You have 40 plus years of experience of studying customers, their behavior and output. So this is just an absolute gold mine for anybody who's willing to watch this. And thank you for taking the time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. When I published the article in Harvard Business Review, I told my wife that week, I said, I don't know if this is going to be like incredibly popular or whether it's going to be a big dud. Like people are going to go, well, this is just obvious. It turned out to be incredibly popular. It was one of the most read articles that year in HBR, and continues to be. And I feel really honored to be able to help people with this topic. And thank you, Jon, for inviting me to your show.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Eric. And where can people catch it? More of your stuff. They want to find out more, actually, before we hit
Bain.com.